October 14, 1942. The checkpoint appeared out of the fog like a wound in the road, two soldiers, a barrier pole, and a lantern swinging in the cold Polish wind. She was 16 years old. Her name was Marta Wisniewska, and beneath the false bottom of the vegetable cart she was pushing, wrapped in oilcloth and packed between loose turnips, were 14 pistols, 400 rounds of ammunition, and a hand-drawn map of every German garrison between Krakow and the Vistula River. She had done this before. She would do it again. For nearly 8 months, the German occupiers of southern Poland searched frantically for the Courier. Their informants called Jaskolka the Swallow. They assumed it was a man. Probably a soldier. Someone hardened, trained, dangerous. They had no idea she was a schoolgirl from a market town, and they were running out of time to find out. The town of Wieliczka sat 7 kilometers southeast of Krakow, low and gray beneath the weight of occupation. It was famous once for its salt mines, ancient underground cathedrals carved by generations of miners, their walls shimmering with crystalline white. Before the war, tourists had come from Vienna and Prague to walk its lit corridors. Children from the surrounding villages had grown up hearing that the earth beneath their feet was hollow and full of wonders. By the autumn of 1942, those same tunnels had become something else entirely. Her father, Tomasz, had taught history and geography at the local gymnasium. He was a quiet man, precise in his speech, who believed that knowing where you stood on a map was the first step toward understanding how to move through the world. He had given Marta her first atlas when she was 7. By 10, she could draw the rail lines of the general government from memory. She was quick, observant, and deeply serious for her age. Not cold, but contained. Her older sister Zofia teased her for reading when other girls danced. Her mother called her the little professor. She had warm brown eyes that missed nothing, and a habit of going very still when she was thinking, the way a hawk does before it drops. In September 1939, German forces arrived. Tomasz Wisniewski was arrested in the first week, one of hundreds of teachers, priests, and professionals swept up in what the occupiers called Aktion AB, the systematic elimination of the Polish intelligentsia. He was taken to a building on Montelupich Street in Krakow. He did not return. Marta's mother, Helena, did not collapse. She compressed. She grew harder and more deliberate, running the household with a precision that seemed to hold the family together by sheer force of will. She sold more preserves. She took in mending. She said prayers in a low voice every evening and taught her daughters that grief was something you carried, not something you wore. The occupation settled over Wieliczka like a second winter one that never lifted. German soldiers requisitioned the best houses. The mines were commandeered for military use. Jewish neighbors were relocated, then disappeared entirely. Curfews made the streets silent after dark. The word verboten appeared on signs, doors, and faces. Marta was 13 when her father was taken. By 15, she was working as a runner for a local underground cell connected to the army at Kojowa, the Home Army, Poland's enormous clandestine resistance network. She carried messages tucked into the lining of her coat, passed folded notes beneath the counters of sympathetic shops, memorized drop locations, and reported them to a man she knew only as Pan Joseph, who met her once a week behind the parish church. She was chosen not despite being a girl, but because of it. A teenage boy loitering near a checkpoint drew attention. A teenage girl pushing a cart of vegetables was invisible. The German soldiers, most of them young conscripts from Bavaria or Silesia, saw in her exactly what they expected to see: a peasant girl, dull-faced with cold, doing peasant things. They didn't look past the turnips, they didn't look at her eyes. That was their first mistake. Her second skill was the mines. She had spent years exploring the tourist levels as a child, and as the occupation deepened, she had mapped on paper she kept hidden beneath a floorboard every accessible shaft, every maintenance corridor, every point where the tunnel surfaced near a road or a rail line. The underground was her geography. And in a country under enemy occupation, geography was power. Pan Jos, whose real name she would only learn after the war, had recognized this the moment he handed her her first assignment. He had watched her face as she memorized the route. She hadn't needed to write it down. "You have a gift," he had said in that careful, unhurried way of his. "Don't waste it on heroics. Be patient. Be ordinary. Ordinary is the most dangerous thing you can be." Marta had nodded. She had already understood. Her first weapons run was in February 1942. The package had arrived via courier from Krakow, a contact in the AK's urban network who passed it through 3 sets of hands before it reached Marta at the back of the preserve shop where she helped her mother. It was wrapped in brown paper and smelled of machine oil, 2 pistols and 6 loaded magazines, intended for a cell operating in the Neopolomais forest, 12 kilometers east of town. Pandrazov had explained the route. There were 2 checkpoints. The first, on the edge of town, was manned by older soldiers who were usually cold and disinterested. The second, near the Forest Road junction, was newer, a mobile unit that changed position and could not be predicted. He had offered her a horse and cart. Marta had thought for 3 days and then rejected it. Too conspicuous, she said. A cart on a frozen road draws more attention than a girl walking to a relative's house. Pan Joseph had studied her for a moment. "Where will you carry them?" She showed him. She had spent the previous winter modifying her coat, a long, heavy wool thing inherited from her father's wardrobe, already oversized on her frame. She had sewn 2 deep internal pockets along the lining, reinforced with canvas to prevent the outline of the objects from showing against her body. Beneath the coat, against the cold, the pistols sat flush against her ribcage, held in place by a tight layer of wrapped cloth. She moved her arms. The coat showed nothing. Pan Joseph had exhaled slowly. "You walk normally?" "I've practiced with books," she said. She walked 12 kilometers in the snow, through 2 checkpoints, and delivered the package to a man named Bronek at the edge of the Neopolomais forest. The older checkpoint soldiers barely glanced at her papers. She carried a forged work permit, identifying her as an agricultural laborer traveling to a relative's farm. The mobile checkpoint was not deployed that day. She was back in Wieliczka before curfew. By April, the system had expanded. The AK's southern network had a critical problem. Weapons and materials were being moved from Krakow through a series of relay points toward forest partisans and safe houses, but the intermediate couriers were unreliable or compromised. 2 had been arrested in the spring. 1 had simply vanished. The routes through the open farmland southeast of the city were increasingly watched. A German intelligence unit based in Krakow had begun cross-referencing movement patterns and was identifying gaps in their surveillance coverage. Marta proposed using the mines. It took 3 meetings and 2 visits from a senior AK officer named Pikat Koski before they agreed to listen properly. She had brought her hand-drawn maps, carefully coded so that nothing identifiable was visible to an outsider, and explained what she knew. There were maintenance tunnels on the western edge of the Wieliczka system that the German administration had not fully surveyed. 2 of them surfaced near the Odspornia stream, which ran northeast toward the forest. The exits were overgrown and had not been inspected since the pre-war tourist operations shut down. If materials were passed into the tunnel entrance in Wieliczka itself, she had identified a storage room accessible from the basement of a sympathizer's house. They could be walked 3 kilometers underground and surfaced at a point that bypassed both major road checkpoints entirely. Piakowski had stared at her across the table. "How old are you?" he asked. "Old enough," she said. "They tested it in May with a single package, documents and a disassembled radio receiver. It worked. By June, the tunnel route was running twice a month, with Marta serving as primary guide because she was the only person who knew every junction by feel, in total darkness. She carried a small shuttered lantern and moved at a pace that experienced men, decades older, struggled to match. The surface runs continued as well. She had refined her concealment methods to accommodate longer pistols, folded messages inside the heels of her shoes, and on one occasion transported a disassembled Sten submachine gun in 3 pieces tucked among bundles of dried herbs and beeswax candles in a market basket. She was stopped at a checkpoint in July. A young sergeant, she remembered his face clearly, broad, pink, suspicious, had looked at her papers and then at the basket. "What's this?" "Candles for the church at Dow," she said. "My aunt asked me to bring them." He had reached into the basket. His hand moved through the candles and the wrapped herbs. The disassembled barrel section of the Sten was at the bottom, wrapped in a cloth that smelled of beeswax. His fingers stopped an inch from it. He pulled out a candle. "What kind?" "Beeswax," she said. "Better for a long burn." He looked at her for another 3 seconds. Then he handed it back. She walked away without changing her pace. She did not exhale for another 100 meters. By August, Marta had completed 11 surface runs and 6 tunnel transports. She had moved, by Pan Joseph's estimate, 43 firearms, nearly 2,000 rounds of ammunition, 12 kilograms of plastic explosive, and enough radio components to assemble 3 field sets. German patrols had stopped her 8 times. She had never once failed to complete a delivery. The German intelligence unit in Krakow had a file. They called the courier Jaskolka, a name picked up from an intercepted communication, origin unknown. They estimated he was in his 30s. Military background, likely operating from a base in the Neapolomese forest. They did not know about the mines. They did not know about the coat. They did not know about the candles. And in September, they made a decision that would bring them, finally, close to her, closer than they had ever been. His name was Hauptsturmführer Klaus Drenner, and he arrived in Rielichka on the 3rd of September, 1942, with a staff car, a briefcase, and a manner that immediately distinguished him from the garrison soldiers who had been managing the town since the occupation began. He was 34 years old, originally from Dresden, and he had spent the previous 2 years in France, where he had broken 3 separate resistance networks by a method that his colleagues found almost unnervingly methodical. He did not chase couriers. He mapped their routes. He had read the file on Jaskolka on the train from Krakow. He had noticed immediately what the previous investigators had missed. The materials being moved through the southern corridor were not following any single consistent route. They surfaced in different locations at different times, with no predictable pattern. The checkpoints had been evaded not by force or bribery, but by some form of systematic variation that suggested intimate local knowledge. "This isn't a soldier," he had told his superior in Krakow before leaving. "This is someone from the area, someone with a reason to move through it regularly." He set up his operation quietly. He didn't increase checkpoint scrutiny that would alert the network. Instead, he began gathering information through a different method. He tasked local informants with cataloging every person in Wieliczka who traveled regularly between the town and the surrounding villages. Farmers, market traders, delivery workers, anyone whose movement had a legitimate documented pattern. He was looking for the anomaly, the route that almost made sense. Within 2 weeks, he had a list of 43 names. And Joseph learned of Drenner's arrival through a contact in the town administration, a sympathizer who handled labor documentation and noticed the new information requests coming through. He sent word to Marta through their usual dead drop, a loose brick in a wall near the market square, behind which a small tin box was concealed. The message was brief. "A hunter has arrived. Pause all operations. Await instruction." Marta read it twice, then burned it over the kitchen stove. She paused the surface runs. She told Pan Joseph she understood, but she did not pause everything. A week after Drenner's arrival, a message came through the tunnel network urgent, passed hand to hand from Krakow. A partisan unit in the Neapolomese forest, 40 men who had been operating since the summer, had been located by a German sweep and were out of ammunition. They had 12 days before another sweep was expected to close in. If they could not be resupplied, they would have to disperse or surrender. The materials were in Wieliczka: 40 pistols, a crate of grenades, and ammunition for a dozen rifles. They had been moved into the sympathizer's basement 2 weeks earlier, before Drenner's arrival, and could not be moved out by surface route without crossing at least one of the now heavily monitored checkpoints. Pan Joseph sent word: "Cannot authorize. Risk too high." Marta spent an entire night sitting at her mother's kitchen table, not moving. In the morning, she went back to him and said, "The tunnel, no surface movement. I take it through the mine entirely." He stared at her for a long time. "That's 40 kilograms of material," he said. "You'd need 2 people at minimum to carry it." 3 passages. "I know," she said. "I'll take Bronick and his brother." "If Drenner finds the tunnel entrance, he won't find it in 12 days, she said. "He doesn't know it exists." Drenner, meanwhile, had narrowed his list. He had eliminated most of the 43 names through cross-referencing people whose movement patterns were fully explainable by documented employment or family situations. He was down to 11. Among them was a young woman identified as Marta Wisniewska, daughter of an arrested schoolteacher who worked part-time at a preserve shop and had been documented moving between Wieliczka and the nearby village of Kokotow on multiple occasions over the previous year, nominally visiting an aunt. He requested her file from the civil registry and read it carefully. Daughter of an intelligentsia family. Father arrested in 1940. No known political affiliations. No prior incidents. He put a small mark next to her name. Not yet, but he was watching. The tunnel operation was planned over 3 nights. Marta had moved larger packages before, but never in a single operation at this scale. The materials in the basement were divided into 4 loads, 3 carried by Marta, Bronik, and his brother Alexei, and a fourth pass for Marta alone, returning for the crate of grenades. The entrance was through the basement floor, a trap door, beneath a heavy wooden shelf that had been in place since before the war. The tunnel beyond was narrow enough that two people could not pass each other. Carved stone, low ceiling, the smell of mineral salt and standing water. In winter, the temperature inside stayed just above freezing. In September, it was merely cold and wet. The first pass went smoothly. The second pass, Alexei stumbled in the dark and went down hard on the stone floor, twisting his ankle badly enough that he could not continue. Marta and Bronik carried his load between them, emerged at the forest exit at 2 a.m., passed the materials to a waiting partisan contact, and returned. It took 4 hours longer than planned. The third pass, the grenades, Marta completed alone. 40 kilograms of material moved through 3 kilometers of underground darkness, across 2 nights, evading a German intelligence officer who was, at that very moment, sitting in a requisitioned office 2 streets away and writing her name on a new list. She had no way of knowing how close he was. The morning after the final pass, she was pushing a small cart of her mother's preserves to the market, a genuine errand, a routine she had deliberately maintained throughout the operation to keep her pattern normal when she passed Drenner on the street for the first time. She didn't know who he was. He was simply a German officer in a gray coat, standing near the corner with a cup of coffee and a thoughtful expression. He glanced at her briefly, the way a man glances at the street cataloging without engagement. She nodded, in the polite, submissive manner she had practiced 100 times, and kept walking. Drenner watched her for a moment. He noted the cart, the preserves, the ease of her movement, natural, unhurried. He noted that she did not look away quickly, the way guilty people do, but held the nod for precisely as long as was appropriate, and then released her gaze with no particular tension. He made a mental note, ruled out he was wrong, and he would not have another chance to correct himself. 3 days later, the partisan unit in the Neapolitamist forest used delivered weapons to ambush a German logistics convoy on the forest road. A single truck carrying officer correspondence and payroll for 2 garrison units. The payroll was destroyed. The correspondence was extracted and passed to AK Intelligence in Krakow, where it turned out to contain deployment schedules for a planned anti-partisan sweep that had been set for late October. The sweep was canceled. 40 men stayed alive who might otherwise have died. Drenner learned of the ambush from his morning briefing. He sat in silence for a long time and then looked back at his list. He had reduced it to 7 names. He read through them again, slowly. Then he wrote a request to the civil registry for the employment records of all 7. The reply came back 2 days later. Among the 7, only 1 had a documented reason, however thin, to travel the specific corridor between Wieliczka and the Neapolitamist area. A girl who visited an aunt in Kokotau and occasionally delivered goods to surrounding farms. He stared at the name for a very long time. He sent a request to have her brought in for questioning. The request was routed through the garrison commander, who passed it to the local police liaison, a Polish collaborator named Simakowski, who happened to be connected through a distant family tie to one of the AK's network of informants. By the time the request reached the relevant desk, Marta had been gone for 4 hours. Pan Joseph had received warning through Simakowski's contact, who had taken a considerable personal risk to pass it on. He sent a message to Marta through her mother, a simple phrase, prearranged, Aunt Basha asks you to visit. There was no Aunt Basha. The phrase meant, leave now, do not return. Marta packed a single small bag. She embraced her mother in the kitchen, and Helena held her for a long moment without saying anything. Then she straightened, brushed Marta's coat with both hands in the way she had always done before school, and nodded. Marta walked out the back door into the September morning and did not look back at the house. She was taken by a contact to a safe house in the village of Bochna, 14 kilometers east, where she would wait for the network to arrange the next step. She was 16 years old. She had been Jaskolka for 8 months. She was still alive. Drenner arrived at the Wisniewska house the following afternoon. He was precise and professional in his manner. He had long ago learned that the theatrical approach achieved less than the methodical one. He spoke to Helena Wisniewska in careful, formal Polish and explained that he needed to speak with her daughter. Helena told him that Marta had gone to visit a cousin in the countryside several days ago and had not yet returned. She provided the name of a village. The village existed. The cousin did not, but the network had prepared for this. A family in the village had agreed to corroborate the story if contacted. Drenner sat across from Helena for 20 minutes. He was, by every account, a perceptive man. He watched her face, her hands, the precise stillness of her body. He had interviewed enough grieving, frightened people to know that what he was seeing was not entirely manufactured. Alina Wisniewska was afraid, but she was afraid the way a wall is not with panic, but with endurance. He thanked her and left. He made a note in his file: subject departed, location unconfirmed, network structure intact. Operation transfer to Krakow District Intelligence. The file on Jaskolka was forwarded upward. It became, in the bureaucratic machinery of German occupation, one unsolved case among hundreds. Priority was recalibrated. Other couriers, other cells, other threats pressed in from every direction. The swallow had gone quiet, and after several weeks of silence, the assumption, never confirmed, never disproven, settled into the file like sediment, that the courier had either been taken elsewhere or had died before being identified. In Bochnia, Marta spent the first week barely speaking. The safe house was a farmhouse belonging to an elderly woman named Pani Kwiatkowska, who fed her soup and asked no questions. Marta sat by the window in the mornings and looked at the fields and found, for the first time, that her mind would not organize itself into tasks. There was nothing to plan, no route to memorize, no checkpoint to calculate. The stillness was harder than the work. Pan Joseph visited once, in the third week, traveling by an indirect route that took most of a day. He sat with her for 2 hours, and at some point he said, "The materials reached Neopolys. The sweep was canceled." Marta nodded. She had already heard through a different chain about the ambush. She had tried to feel satisfaction about it and found something more complicated. Not regret exactly, but a weight. 40 men who were alive because of 40 kilograms of metal she had dragged through 3 kilometers of darkness. She understood that this was the point of what she had done. She also understood that C could not fully feel it, not yet. "Your mother is safe," Pan Joseph added. This she felt. The network did not send her back to operations for 3 months. When she eventually returned to work under a new identity, operating from a different town, running a different kind of route, she was 17, and she moved through checkpoints with the same composed, unhurried ease, but she was not the same person who had first sewn pistols into a coat lining. She was quieter, more deliberate. The war had carved something out of her and filled the space with something harder and less visible. Bronick was arrested in December 1942, not through Drenner's investigation, but through a separate betrayal by an informant in Krakow. He spent the remainder of the war in a labor camp and survived, though barely. Alexei, the brother with the twisted ankle, eventually joined a partisan unit in the forest and fought until liberation. Pan Joseph, whose name Marta would learn after the war was Joseph Sironkevich, a name that would become significant in post-war Poland for entirely different reasons, continued his work until the Warsaw Uprising and beyond. He survived. Drenner was reassigned to the Eastern Front in early 1943. He did not survive the war. The tunnel beneath Wieliczka Marta's tunnel was never discovered by the German administration. When Soviet forces liberated the area in January 1945, the entrance was still sealed, the trapdoor behind the shelf undisturbed. Inside the mine, in the cold mineral dark, someone had scratched a small mark into the stone wall near the second junction, a tiny bird in flight, barely visible. The kind of mark a person makes not for others to find, but simply to say, "I was here." Marta Wisniewska survived the war. She was 19 years old when it ended, a fact that seemed simultaneously impossible and entirely ordinary, the way the most extraordinary things often do when you are standing on the other side of them. She returned to Wieliczka in the summer of 1945. The town had changed in the way everything had changed. Certain houses were gone, certain streets felt wrong in a way she could not name, certain faces were absent so permanently that their absence had become architectural, built into the structure of the place itself. Her mother was alive and had spent the occupation years working quietly, maintaining a surface of absolute ordinariness that had protected them both. They did not talk at first about what Marta had done. They planted a garden, they repaired the fence, they made preserves. Marta enrolled in teaching college in Krakow the following year, studying the same geography and history her father had taught. She kept no notes from the occupation. She carried no documents. What she remembered, She remembered the way a geographer remembers terrain, not as narrative, but as form, as structure, as the shape of space under difficult conditions. For decades, the story of Jaskolka existed only in fragments in the oral histories of surviving partisans, in AK intelligence files that were partially preserved and partially destroyed, in the memories of people who, for political reasons in post-war Poland, often found it safer not to speak of wartime resistance. It was not until the 1980s when historians began more systematically documenting the role of women couriers in the Armia Krajowa that Marta's name surfaced in the record. A researcher named Krystyna Nowak-Jakubowska, working from recovered AK documents and interviews with aging survivors, pieced together enough of the Jaskolka operation to publish a brief academic account in 1987. She tracked Marta down by then a retired schoolteacher in her 60s, living in Krakow. They met twice. Marta answered questions carefully. She confirmed the tunnels. She confirmed the routes. When asked how she had managed the fear, the checkpoints, the weight of what she was carrying, the knowledge of what would happen if she was caught, she was quiet for a moment. "I didn't think about it that way," she said at last. "I thought about the route. The next step, the checkpoint is here, the exit is there. The distance between them is this many paces. You think about the geometry. If you think about the fear, you've already lost the geometry." The researcher asked if she considered herself a hero. Marta looked out the window at the Krakow skyline for a long moment. "I carried things from one place to another," she said. "The men in the forest were the ones who fought. I just made sure they had something to fight with." She died in 2009 at the age of 83. In the WWII salt mine, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, visited by over 1 million tourists a year, there is a small plaque on the wall of one of the lower maintenance corridors. It was installed in 2012 at the request of local historians. Most visitors pass it without stopping. It reads simply, "In memory of those who used this place for courage." Somewhere in the stone nearby, if you look very carefully, there is a small scratch mark barely visible, worn almost smooth by decades of damp air. A bird in flight. The forest and the mine and the cold, dark corridors of history they remember, even when we forget to look.